Brian Mahoney, Chief Business Officer at Thesis and co-founder of Mezo. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on. Excited to be here, Peter.
So I want to start out with something controversial you said. Actually, it's not controversial, but it is interesting though. You called yourself a Bitcoin Stoic. Maybe give us a sense of what that means,
Yeah, sure.
and then help us understand kind of like how you got into the whole crypto space.
Yeah, so Bitcoin Stoic is our term for the Bitcoin maxis. So we believe that there's sort of a better way to describe them. Maybe Bitcoin maxi or the term maxi is a little bit aggressive on the description. So for us, we prefer the term Stoic, which really just means long-term believer, holder, and particularly a believer in the kind of what Bitcoin is about, the ethos of it. And for us, we refer to that as freedom tech. We got into Bitcoin and have been building in Bitcoin because we believe in the ethos first and foremost, and the power to sort of revolutionize capital markets, finance, global markets as it is. And so that's sort of why we call it Stoics versus Maxis. And because a lot of them, we like to believe are users, not just holders as well. So that's sort of how we think about the user demographic internally. And then in terms of my story and how I got into the space. So I like to say I'm a former TradFi guy turned DeFi degen. But what I mean by that is I was in traditional capital markets and finance banking world for just about 10 years before I took the leap full-time into crypto. This was back in 2016. And Bitcoin and the promise of sort of blockchain technology was my sort of initial bite at the rabbit hole, and then since then I've been working on really building and trying to democratize capital markets and finance ever since. And I have this sort of tailwind belief that blockchains are how internet money, which is really what Bitcoin and the rest of crypto is all about. It should be built on an internet first and native experience. If you think about the way blockchains are designed, they're built for an internet, 24/7, globally accessible financial world. And the current banking system, conversely, is operated on the Swift network, which was, built in a analog pre-internet world, dating back to the late 80s and 90s. So if you're a believer that the internet and the power of digitally native and just in general apps and the way that we interact as a sort of human race and economy globally today, if the internet can continue to proliferate and eat everything, finance is up next, and it starts with blockchains and Bitcoin.
How do you balance kind of the long-term vision and ideology, the CryptoPunk ideology with practicality?
Yeah, it's a great question, which is kind of why we call it this. That's why we use the term Stoic as opposed to Maxi. I think it's definitely a little bit of a barbell or sort of pendulum type approach. Having that 10-year vision, but thinking, okay, how do you bootstrap that along the way? I refer to this as sort of like the 0 to 1 stage, which is like the classic, idea to product in the startup world and finding that product market fit. And then the 1 to 2 stage, which is, how do you scale beyond and really hit, 100 million plus users, make a difference in kind of the average everyday lives of people around the world. And so for us, what we're doing is building towards that 10-year vision. And we have been, because Thesis actually has been building on and around Bitcoin since dating back to 2014. But for us, finding those use cases along the way is critical so we can keep that snowball and momentum going. So it's really, starting first, especially with like a lot of the kind of the beachhead or like land and expand use cases are crypto native or DeFi, decentralized finance type users, finding that and then, bootstrapping from there and kind of finding that product market fit beyond and to the average users. And I think it's been a little bit of a challenge, not just for us, but the space in general, especially with some of the regulatory headwinds that have been faced in the industry. But I think, we've hit sort of a, at least from a United States perspective, there's been a lot of that's been opening up, especially with the new administration that's coming in. And I think regulatory clarity is here. So that should make, things a bit easier going forward, is the hope with that clarity. To really kind of, move from beyond just like that crypto native, DeFi use case into real world use cases or Web 2, if you call it that. And that's the thinking there. So we're positioned for both and expanding iteratively along the way.
Phrases that you use like beachhead, land, and expand sounds very practical to me. And it's actually refreshing to hear that, because you don't hear that from a lot of crypto native folks. And it shows that you're coming into the crypto space with a rich and varied business background, which I think is very helpful for crypto in general. Let's switch to Thesis and Mezo. For the audience who may not be familiar with Thesis, maybe tell us about that, and then how Mezo came out of that.
Yeah, sure. So Thesis, as I mentioned, has been around dating back to 2014. We've been building in the space. Our first company was this company called Fold, which is still around today. They actually listed on the NASDAQ in the US here publicly. Actually, the bell ringing was about a couple weeks ago from this recording. So we're pretty excited to that. It was excited about that. It was a 9-year journey to get to that point. And, I think is showing that the power of Bitcoin and native applications is starting to really hit more of the average kind of user and becoming mainstream. And for us, Thesis, it's really just kind of been tightening and iterating on that playbook as we go along ever since we started with Fold. Since then, we prefer to kind of do 1 to 2 projects a cycle. So we're a studio model where we put our own capital and resources in first. As a company, we have there's about 70 folks at Thesis, and it really boils down to like proving these kind of product market use cases, getting into what's going to make a difference, in people's lives, and how do we make Bitcoin useful, which is our North Star. So we tend to make, deep conviction bets, 1 to 2 a cycle. And this current cycle, Mezo is one of those main bets. We've done a few others along the years. We have TBDC, which is a Bitcoin bridge that's sort of analogous to, if you're familiar, or if your audience is familiar with WBTC. It's a wrapped Bitcoin competitor, but it has more of a decentralized signer set. So it's very much aligned with the Bitcoin ethos. So a lot of these like wrapped Bitcoins are 2 of 3 or, more centralized in nature. And for us, we've tried to make, TBDC and related products as close to Bitcoin as possible in terms of the decentralization, open source, kind of public good ethos. And then Mezo in particular is kind of the expansion upon that. We realized that, the sort of the side chain or Bitcoin L2, kind of whatever you want to call it, roll up, there's plenty of different names for it, has still not quite found the product market fit yet in the space, although there's been a lot of folks attacking it over the years and trying to, kind of create this beyond HODL type of use case for Bitcoin. And it's pretty clear that, it's challenging to do that on the native Bitcoin L1. And so that's why an L2 or sidechain sort of use case makes sense, because it creates, it unlocks that scalability, but still can kind of tie back to Bitcoin at the end of the day. And so for us, that's what Mezo is about, is, creating a place where you can come and make your Bitcoin useful and really kind of create almost like a bank on yourself type experience, which means, you can hold and speculate if you want, but you can also maybe take out a loan against your Bitcoin. You can maybe earn some yield on your Bitcoin. You can shop with your Bitcoin. You can participate you can donate with your Bitcoin. You can participate in liquidity pools with your Bitcoin. So there's plenty of different kind of use cases that Mezo unlocks that, aren't currently possible on native Bitcoin L1.
Got it. So if you were speaking to the mainstream audience, like how would you describe Mezo to them, and then maybe take us through like the key target audiences and the messaging to each one?
Yeah, sure. So the core use case, or the headline for Mezo, is bank on yourself. And what we mean by that is it's a place that you can control your entire journey. You don't have to like give up custody of your underlying BTC. You can, control and operate as an individual along the way. Or an institution. There's no third parties or intermediaries that you have to trust. No black boxes. Nothing is off chain. So you can take, your Bitcoin, deposit it into these contracts that are fully open source, decentralized. We have 21 plus validators on Mezo as it stands, so it's already pretty decentralized. And moving into the application layer, once you're on the chain, you'll be able to really, one of the core use cases is Bitcoin financing. So where we believe is a major opportunity is moving towards use cases that allow you to hold or continue to partake in the upside of your underlying equity, which in this case would be Bitcoin, and use other financial tools, if you will, to make it useful. So the flagship product of Mezo and the chain is MUSD, which is our Bitcoin-backed stablecoin. And it is a way for you to borrow against your Bitcoin at a pretty competitive rate. About 1% out of the gates is what we're going to be charging folks, or what the chain will be charging folks. So undercutting a lot of the competitive offerings out there, as well as not bringing in any additional risks in the form of like credit risk, for example, or black boxes of rehypothecation. Your Bitcoin sits on Mezo at all times, and you're able to control that journey and decide what you do with it along that way, which is very appealing to the Bitcoin Stoic crowd.
That sounds really interesting. Tell us about MUSD.
Sure.
What I guess what are some of the use cases, and how for a stable coin to make sense and to have eventually get traction, it's got to be used in other protocols.
Yes.
What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so the way we're thinking about this is a sort of a 3-phase rollout process. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue. If you're familiar with kind of bootstrapping marketplaces, you have the supply side and the demand side. And usually when, and this could apply, not just crypto, like Uber, for example, is like the classic chicken and egg. You got cars and you got people looking to take cars or rides, right? And so as you scale out this application, if you focus on both, right, sometimes that tends to not really work that well in bootstrapping a marketplace. So that's why I use these terms like land and expand or beachhead. So for us, what that boils down to with bootstrapping MUSD on Mezo is focusing on the supply side first, and then moving into the demand side next. So supply side is just simply deposits, meaning growing the balance sheet or the capital on the system, because the more capital you have and the more volumes you have, the more things you can do off the back of that. So that's really kind of the key thing, is to build that foundation for MUSD on Mezo, as well as other places that MUSD might be available. And then, for us, the target is to grow to $1 billion plus dollars worth of Bitcoin on the system. And then folks can, as that volume and capital grows on the chain, folks can borrow against that and use it to access or deploy on the demand and hold side. So one of the kind of initial use cases for MUSD will just be simply getting yield, which creates a nice flywheel and opens up the ability for you to not only access or kind of maintain the upside on your underlying spot BTC, especially as we might be entering a new bull market here. I think that's, pretty appealing to folks from what we've seen. And then they'll be able to kind of double dip and open up, other types of yield opportunities off the back of that. And taking it one step further beyond just like a yield or a hold use case, actually using it in the real world. That's where we're going. So starting kind of DeFi native first, but moving into off-chain use cases like on-ramps and centralized exchange venues, for example, opening up, donating to Bitcoin Foundation is another example where we'll be able actually to enable that. Shopping and e-commerce is another use case where we think, an MUSD use case might make sense for folks, because rarely do you have folks that want to, spend their Bitcoin on like a gift card or a T-shirt or something like that. But if you enable a stable coin against that, they're more likely willing to spend that stable coin and engage in that while still holding their underlying principal.
What do you think of I think it's Steak and Shake restaurant that announced
Yes.
that they'll be accepting Bitcoin now? What do you think of that approach? Do you think that's that they're really sincere, or is it just a marketing thing?
Probably a little bit of both, but regardless, it's a massive moment for Bitcoin development, and shows the real world use cases for Bitcoin are not just holding or speculating. I think the momentum and hype that partnership has generated, Steak and Shake with Lightning and some of the providers there is great for Bitcoin, because that continues to further drive positive sentiment, and especially in the kind of your average retail user or participant. So for me, I think it's a huge and positive development for Bitcoin's evolution. Now, me personally, would I want to go spend my Bitcoin at Steak and Shake? I think it depends where we are in the cycle. But I think in general, it's a net positive for the tailwinds of Bitcoin and the use cases beyond it. I think, for us, though, we're ultimately more in kind of the camp of let's hold the equity and upside, and open up ways for you to borrow against or get collateral, get loans against your Bitcoin collateral.
I think that makes sense. And I think I can see a lot of people preferring to actually do that and not use their Bitcoin, but instead borrow against it. That seems to be a very kind of popular use case.
Yes. And I think the Bitcoin lending space too is also just on that, rapidly heating back up. I think it was hot back in the days of like BlockFi and Celsius with, kind of 2020, 2021, 2022 timeframe. But, it showed that with those companies' failings, that the kind of the traditional like rehypothecation or traditional like bank lending model is not quite a fit for Bitcoin and its use cases there. So that's kind of why we ultimately as well like have landed on this sort of bank on yourself narrative and use case for mezo with Bitcoin, because we believe that folks that are holding Bitcoin ultimately want to continue to keep and holding their Bitcoin, right? Capture that upside. But when you can get a loan against that and do it in a way that you control your own journey end to end, it becomes quite appealing, and do it at an extremely low and competitive cost of capital, right? That doesn't allow you to, doesn't have like forced repayments, or, you can't view your balances or anything like that. Because, a lot of times when you look at like let's say you're on like a Coinbase exchange or one of these centralized venues, that number that you see on the screen, even like in traditional finance with your checking account and bank account, the number you see on the screen when you go into like your checking account or your account balance is not technically sitting there, right? It's this thing called rehypothecation. The bank is, how they're paying you money with that interest rate in your account is because they're lending your capital out on the other side. And, with the regulatory, especially in the US with FDIC insurance, right, you're covered up to $250,000 worth of capital in your account. But, with the sort of the lagging regulatory frameworks, and especially in the US around crypto and crypto banking, right, a lot of folks haven't had sort of that luxury of relying on, the US government to make sure that they have sort of a backstop. And so that's also, we'll see kind of how things play out with regulatory and capital markets frameworks. But I think for now, like, people are just generally mistrusting of these centralized players. And so that's why for us, especially if you're a Bitcoin holder, a bank on yourself sort of operation makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. The headline bank on yourself has really nice soft edges. It's not aggressive. And it's very inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Other Bitcoin layer twos they kind of err on the very technical side, and they're clearly speaking to a different audience.
Yeah.
Tell us how you're thinking about the Bitcoin L2 space and where mezo fits.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's a pretty competitive category. I think after last year, it was in 2024, it was one of the most well-funded categories by investors in the industry, in the crypto industry. I count probably 100 plus Bitcoin L2s at this point. Side chains. I'm calling it Bitcoin L2 side chains. They're all sort of the same thing for me, which in the sense, they're attacking it from different problems, which is, one is making Bitcoin useful, I think, and two is scaling the Bitcoin product and blockchain without having to do anything on the L1 hard forks, that sort of thing, to make it scalable. And so for us at Mezo, we are not positioning ourselves as like a generic Bitcoin L2. We are marketing to developers, but and we have open source docs, GitHub, all of that folks can go on and deploy and use. Mezo will be sort of a public good at the end of the day. And it's going to be launching, by the way, here very shortly on mainnet. So a little bit of alpha here for your viewers.
Nice.
Yeah, so keep an eye out at Bitcoin Vegas at the end of the month here. But in terms of the sort of the differentiating factor, you can almost think of us as like an application first and a chain second. And what I mean by that is if you look at like the evolution of, let's say, some other projects in the space that have found product market fit, eventually they end up building down the stack, right? Because usually they'll start out, especially if they're like a DeFi app, they'll start out in Ethereum first, but they're paying those third-party fees to the Ethereum network through gas fees, for example. So like a DYDX is a great example of this. One of the first movers in this category. They launched on ETH and then eventually moved down the stack after finding product market fit and built, their own sort of ecosystem, top up to top down. And so for us, we took a little bit of a different approach. We started bottoms up, kind of in those learnings of builders before us, and said, okay, let's build this chain first, make it super competitive from a fee and transaction fee standpoint. And then, as we kind of build that up, launch an application on top that, speaks to folks directly and an immediate product market fit use case. So it allows us to be super scalable and composable out of the gates while making sure that, we stay as true to Bitcoin and the ethos of Bitcoin as possible, which is, open source, community-led, decentralization, all of that.
You mentioned mainnet coming up, and a really important part of all crypto projects is, building a community, a thriving, engaged community prior to launching a mainnet. How has that effort been for you and Mezo?
It's a big lift launching a chain, that's for sure. There's a lot that goes into it. It's not just simply spinning up a little code and shipping. You gotta, you really kind of with launching a chain, your product is the economy. It's not just one product kind of thing. You have to think about a lot of other types of use cases. So for us, like for example, we have developers as one cohort of users. We have validators and chain operators as another cohort. We have users, just general users who want to come in and use the products as another group. We have investors as another group. So it just really launching a chain. I think it just really expands the scope of all the different sort of things you have to think about. And for us, though, it's right in our sweet spot. I mean, because we've been building on Bitcoin and around Bitcoin for the last 10 plus years at Thesis, a chain was sort of a natural fit of our evolution because we have, a track record of shipping 8+ apps and companies over the years. So we view, launching Mezo as sort of a completion of this almost 10-year journey of evolution. And for us, it's it is the first time where we have an on-chain, platform in place that we can tie everything together. So it's a nice sort of bow on top for everything we've been building over the last 10 years at Thesis.
I love interviewing Bitcoin projects or projects that are, trying to carry Bitcoin forward and making it more mainstream. I've met with lots of them in the last couple of months with Citrea, CoreDAO, Babylon, Lombard, and others too. And it's really refreshing to see that. And one question I've asked all of them, you mentioned, Bitcoin Maxi and you prefer, Bitcoin Stoic, which I like, by the way. It's a lot softer and less aggressive.
So we're after.
Yeah. And it's also more truthful, right? It's Bitcoin is what it is. You just kind of roll with it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I want to be a Maxi, but I'll be a Stoic.
Yeah, me too. As you think about Bitcoin as a useful and as a useful asset, and how do you reconcile the fact that some people would just prefer to just hold it, right? And it's a store of value, and transacting with it doesn't make any sense to them.
Yeah.
I can see MUSD as a solution to that audience type who might not be interested in doing really anything with their Bitcoin, but they would prefer to borrow against it. And I think that's a very large market. For those that are building programmable kind of solutions for Bitcoin, an L2, how do you respond to the Bitcoin audience that might not view that as a good thing? Like that's against, cypherpunk principles or whatever. And I'm sure there's probably some voices like that. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for us, it's really about use cases, right? So I think those folks that are building scalability solutions or things that are maybe more directly tied into the Bitcoin L1, not necessarily creating a side chain or an L2. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to make Bitcoin more useful, right, in our respective backgrounds and focus areas. So for us, um, I think there's been a lot of people that are focused on scaling Bitcoin from a code and use case standpoint. Payments, right? That's a big focus of Lightning, um, and I think there's a lot of capital going in, but there's not a little bit of an overlooked area is these kind of application layer type of use cases that are on chain. And so for us, it made a lot of sense to focus on this area because number one, we have a lot of background in building consumer and retail focused products, kind of dating back to Fold and the work we did there. So it's sort of a natural fit from our skill set and what we think is our kind of advantages as builders in the space. We know this market well, and I also think that these some of these other approaches are a little bit more of a boil the ocean type approach. It's going to require a lot of capital, a lot of convincing of different community groups and users to adopt this standards, right? Because if you're going to unlock a payments network, you got to agree on a standards that's going to be across a lot of different groups of users, and that's going to take some time to kind of get that, as we've seen, right? I mean, Lightning's been doing this for quite some time. Lightspark and David Marcus, his project, right? So there's a lot of different attempts at kind of taking a bite of the same apple, but trying it a little bit of a different way. And so for us, indirectly, we're addressing quite a lot of that, but we believe that the use case should be application first. And if you can get that product market fit out of the gates and really tap into, a new user group or an existing user group that maybe has been dormant for some time, and reactivate those folks and drive excitement, I think that, the rest of the stuff should accelerate. So in a lot of ways, we're all kind of attacking the same problem. It's just a little bit of a different sort of path to get there.
And I think the strengths that your team brings is you guys have gained quite a bit of insight on like the crypto consumer.
Yes.
And crypto has, one criticism against it is that, almost every application is at the infrastructure level and there are no like real users, but we know that's not true. There are real users. And there's a couple of consumer applications.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about some of the insights, over the last, 7 to 10 years, you guys have gained a lot of insights around the crypto consumer.
Yeah.
What are a couple of those that maybe we can learn from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say that one of the first things that came to mind was the user experience so UI, UX, user interface, user experience. I think we have a long way to go with building blockchain applications. If you compare like what's in the Apple App Store, the Android, Google App Store, many of those are Web 2 or, Web 2 off-chain apps that interact with the blockchain indirectly. And I think the next step is, building it natively on chain, but still keeping in mind that, hey, users still don't want to have this. They're not willing to necessarily trade user experience for going on chain, right? So that's been something that's been overlooked. I think in these past few cycles is, people designing the best token economics or incentive design or ways to yield farm, these types of things. And that's been great. But I think it's we're sort of at the cap of that moving the needle and bringing in new money and new users and new excitement into the space. And so for crypto to kind of take the next leap, when I say crypto, Bitcoin and all of the other digital assets as well, ETH, Solana, in general, the user experience and sort of friction to using these applications still needs to be solved. I would love it if like my, mom or dad who are not crypto native by any means and barely even internet native, frankly, had the ability to easily use and sign up for one of these applications. And I think that experience we're on the cusp of it. We're not quite there yet, but there's definitely a lot of focus going into here from a builder standpoint. And so that's something that, we're focused on kind of moving the needle forward on. When folks go to the mezo.org site, they'll be able to see kind of this firsthand. You'll be able to do all of this in one place, have a great user experience, and shop natively within and use MUSD in a real world application, not just for like a yield farming application. Of course, we'll have that too. But that's kind of table stakes right now in the space. Really, if you want to kind of move the ball forward, I think it's really unlocking this seamless user experience. And the kind of the goalpost for me on this one is folks not even knowing that they're interacting with crypto at the end of the day, but having all that complexity abstracted away. You don't even know that you're dealing on a blockchain or that you're working on a blockchain, right? It's just ultimately it's just a great app, a great use case, something that solves whatever you're looking to solve, which is why you probably went to the app in the first place. But doing that in a way that's intuitive and not, crypto and non-crypto kind of thing.
I love that, and it's so refreshing to hear. And I'm seeing more and more projects, viewing complexity as one of the key kind of sources of friction and really the enemy of the consumer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But it wasn't always the case, right? Because remember the days of the white papers, like there was
exactly
a direct. If your project didn't have a white paper, right? It's like, okay, what are you doing, right? But now it's like if you're launching a white paper, most people aren't even reading it, right? They're putting it into ChatGPT and asking for a TLDR summary. So I think having that design and from a white paper, an economics design is still obviously very critical. But it doesn't necessarily need to be like the face of the marketing, right? And that's really for us. We just want to build real apps for real users and real use cases that solve and make a difference in people's lives. And leading with a white paper is great, but that's not necessarily the best way maybe to market and get kind of the next billion of users, group of users adopted.
I think there's kind of a weird cultural thing within the crypto space. I've launched a couple of layer ones and have worked very closely with founders, and have led growth at a number of layer one projects. And I've always found that technical co-founders, they have this, like, they're enamored by complexity and by technical jargon,
mm-hmm.
when that's the very thing that's actually kind of drives actual users away. But I think their background in academia, for some reason, like they get extra like brownie points for using technical jargon and buzzwords. And it's hard.
That's been rewarded, right? Because
that's exactly right.
But now it's shifting, right? So you can no longer get by with just like narrative and technical jargon.
Yeah.
There's this flight to fundamentals that has come back around. I think a lot of people have gotten burned and sort of fallen into some of these complexity traps. And sometimes things can definitely be too complicated, right? And you might lose funds or something because you don't even know what exactly it is you're doing. It's just something that you read on Twitter that seemed like a good idea at the time. So for us, we're trying to make it super intuitive for folks and just, abstract away that complexity as much as possible. And the same thing goes, we're talking about retail here, but I would say the same thing goes for traditional finance. My dream is that capital markets, which is just generally capital flows across the world, or traditional finance, right? We're still separating between crypto and TradFi or traditional finance. Ultimately, I think these two things will converge, and we're not even going to be calling it crypto anymore. It's just going to be capital markets, right? And you're seeing this happen already now, especially with the acceleration of what's now being called real world assets, or RWAs. But that's another area that these kind of worlds are converging between traditional finance. Banks can now start custodying crypto in the U.S. It's becoming less and less of a sort of a divisive issue amongst regulators and traditional finance market operators, and they see it as kind of the next growth engine. So I almost think of it as like an analogy is the banks are still operating on like paper thank yous or something, and we're operating on email, and eventually everyone just sort of moves to email, right? And so that's what sort of I view crypto being, the email analogy in this instance.
Another source of friction that I'm really pleased to see projects attacking right now is bridging assets. Mm-hmm. Bridging assets is such a weird concept if you really think about it.
Yes, yeah.
And I love how a couple of wallet providers are approaching it. There's one called Infinix. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
The synthetics guys, yeah.
Yeah. So they've branded this word called swidge, which is, you swap bridge at the same time. But then the bridging aspect, the user's actually not even aware that there's bridging activity happening. Abstracting that type of complexity away is so helpful for the user.
Yeah.
There are some users that want to know and how the sausage is being manufactured. But most of us just kind of want it done. Like we have a
Yeah,
job to be done. Let's just get
exactly.
it done so I can move on and like play with my kids.
That's right.
And I think that's going to be the majority of the audience, I think. And
Yeah,
it's really refreshing to see that, and that, you know, you and the Mezo team are approaching product development that way also.
definitely. Yeah. And that's a great example with Infinex. I think that approach is becoming a lot more commonplace. I mean, bridging assets is a complicated feat. So, you know, that's a great area to start. I think a lot of room for improvement on abstracting away complexity, especially when it comes to bridging Bitcoin, which is sort of its own, you know, ecosystem of standards, to like an Ethereum or a Solana, which each has their own standards as well. So like the ERC20 token standard is, you know, adopted and used in which is a Ethereum standard for tokens, is adopted and used in most off-chain and centralized venues, right? So if you choose a non-ERC20 venue or a non-ERC20 approach, right, then you open yourself up to a lot more complexity there. So it's like thinking about, okay, what are the standards? What are the use cases here? And I think, you know, that's one of the challenges that Bitcoin has had, is it's sort of isolated in this like fungibility and accessibility standpoint. And so that's another area where a lot of like side chains and L2s are trying to address. And same with these like wrapped Bitcoin assets, which, you know, we call them wrapped Bitcoin assets, but really they're just bridges at the end of the day, kind of under the hood. So that's something that is an interesting area to watch in space too. I think there's a convergence occurring there more and more.
I don't want to, you know, be too competitor focused, but I think it might be helpful for the audience to get a sense of kind of what the layer two landscape looks like and who the major players are.
Sure.
Would you mind going through that for us and just giving us a sense of like who the players are and where Mezo could fit in?
Yeah, sure. So I think just to sort of set the ground a little bit, so you have like kind of the Bitcoin L1 ecosystem, let's call it, and even like ordinals and Bitcoin NFTs, I would say, are in that camp. And then you have like the Ethereum EVM ecosystem, which includes like exchange chains like Base or Coinbase, for example. Arbitrum is another example beneath L2. And then you have like Solana, right, which is sort of its own, you have the Solana virtual machine, another sort of group of standards that, you know, Solana is continually eating into the Ethereum use cases, I think, and, you know, stands out for different reasons. And I think Bitcoin L2s as a category is sort of following these three buckets generally. So you have folks that, you know, maybe are trying to be as close to Bitcoin as possible. So that might be like, you know, Lightning or Lightspark, something like that, which would be sort of, I would put that as like more of like a technical use case or builder. So like Alpine Labs would be one, Citria is one, that are sort of, you know, building for the technical audience as much as possible. And then you have like the second camp, which is, we'll call it the EVM or hybrid category. Those are L2s like, or Bitcoin L2s like Bob, for example, stands for Build on Bitcoin. Hemi is another one, HEMI. And these are, you know, really kind of going in on what they're calling like DeFi or Bitcoin Fi, and sort of trying to merge like the Ethereum world with the Bitcoin world and tapping into both. And then you have a third camp that is, you know, call it like maybe Solana or other chain focused. Arch Network is a good example of this. There's also some ones that are kind of doing more with just like Solana natively and Bitcoin there. Like there's a project called Lava, for example, that's doing Bitcoin backed loans starting with Solana. And for us, sort of how we fit in, I would say we're trying to be as close as possible to Bitcoin in terms of the development and focus there. So we want to cater to the Bitcoin Stoic or the Bitcoin Maxi group, you know, staying true to our roots and DNA of being, you know, as close to Bitcoin and the ethos there as possible, but, you know, taking some learnings from the Ethereum and Solana ecosystems in terms of the use cases and bringing in new users and adoption to the space. So our application layer is more tied into these types of users and use cases. So in essence, the way we think about ourselves is almost like an app chain. And we've chosen a very tech neutral stack that can be directly compatible with Bitcoin. Our gas asset on Mezo is actually Bitcoin as well. So when you, you know, pay for transactions or use MUSD because we'll have other apps on there. We have a lot of different DeFi, just like decentralized exchange apps. We'll have some consumer apps as well. You'll be able to shop and donate on Mezo too when we launch. And all of those use cases, you'll be actually able to spend a little bit of Bitcoin to engage, and that's how the validators process and get paid in the transactions. But the application layer and the tokens themselves will have that ERC20 standard, so you'll be able to tap into any chain you want to that's outside of Bitcoin L1, enable that cross functionality and fungibility, which we think is super important because you want to enable that volume and capital that I mentioned at the beginning. Because if you don't have that, then you don't really have anything to build off of, right? So you need to get that capital flowing. And then from there, moving into kind of off-chain types of use cases. But ultimately, everything will kind of come back to the Mezo core chain, which is the settlement layer and the source of truth for the ledger.
Got it. Okay. So you mentioned, leading with the application first. Does the application that Mezo will be launching with, have you announced what that is yet? And
it'll be MUSD. Yeah.
MUSD. Got it.
So that's the flagship application. We'll have other, third-party apps. It's an open source community that you can build on. Everything code is open source. So we'll have about 10 apps on there that launch out of the gates here, upcoming in a few weeks. But yeah, then beyond that, really expanding into kind of these real world use cases and further blurring the line between Web 2 and Web 3.
That's awesome. Okay, I apologize for missing that earlier.
No worries.
That is
There's
really,
a lot to
really
take
cool.
in, I know, because it's not just a product, right? It's literally like you're building like a small city or economy kind of. So you got the city hall, you got the utilities companies, you have, which are almost like the validators, right? The city hall is like the foundation, right? Mm-hmm. Then you have maybe mom and pop shops that are opening up on Main Street. You have residents coming in, which is the community, right? The mom and pop shops being like the DeFi apps, right? And they offer different services. The community bank, right? So that's, if you think about kind of this analogy of a city, that's really what Mezo is creating. It's a place that you can come and make your Bitcoin useful, use it, and everything is denominated in Bitcoin. So it's a destination in the on-chain world. But that's if folks want to go all the way down the rabbit hole, and especially that's part of the more seasoned and experienced users. And if you're less of an experienced user and maybe you're just a tourist passing through the city, but you still want to use a couple apps, maybe visit the bank or go, get a meal at a restaurant, right? You can still do that with MUSD, maybe on another chain, right? Or another partner platform like a centralized exchange or on-ramp.
As you're kind of designing as a city planner and kind of ecosystem and economy builder, are you designing MUSD to be kind of the center of gravity for this economy?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Outside of Bitcoin, MUSD is at the center of everything. Yeah.
I think that's brilliant, and that's actually quite exciting.
So anytime you transact from, like, let's say, because when you are the depositor, when you're the depositor on Mezo, you can also be the borrower. So you'll be depositing, let's say, people are doing this now. We have about $400 million worth of Bitcoin on there to date, with line of sight to $1 billion plus here. So we're scaling pretty rapidly. And then we have, incentives, which are kind of like tax breaks, right? Or different like grants from the government kind of thing. So same sort of analogies of setting up this city that Mezo will enable, right? For folks to come in and build and or use what we offer in this community. And so with MUSD, there's a nice tight flywheel between Bitcoin being used on the chain as well as the Mezo token, which is kind of the key way how the city or Mezo economy governs itself.
Yeah. This is an interesting question because this is, I think, what every project that has an application first and then a chain kind of takes a backseat, but that eventually becomes the most, one of the more important parts, right? Because of these permissionless systems. How do you deal with like a naming convention with, MUSD is going to be the flagship product, and then it's on the Mezo chain, but then Mezo has a bunch of other applications on it. How do you deal with like who gets the limelight, and how do you help these ecosystem projects get users, and especially around the naming convention? Because you want MUSD to get the limelight, but it's on Mezo chain.
Yes.
And And you also want Mezo to get some awareness so that other projects that want to grow their ecosystem can build natively on Mezo.
Yeah,
Anyway,
exactly.
it's multivariate kind of challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. We're there's a little bit of a kind of a land and expand type approach to this. So coming out of the gates, just being super loud and educating folks. We have a lot of documentation, content, blogs, things like this to educate folks on Mezo and MUSD. So those are the sort of the two leading headlines, if you will, for the chain launch. But as we go along and continue to mature as an ecosystem, continually putting the spotlight on more and more applications. And MUSD and Mezo, will still be important, but functionally more important in terms of like the center of the ecosystem, but maybe not as upfront from a marketing standpoint. We'll continue to kind of, as we mature and scale, take a little bit of a backseat and try to empower and showcase our community and users more and more.
Oh, Brian, looking ahead, you mentioned Bitcoin Las Vegas. And what else could the community kind of rally around, get excited by, and maybe start participating in?
So I think the biggest thing will be Mezo. So Mezo and MUSD is on testnet right now. Mainnet is coming very, very shortly. Can't say the public date yet, but certainly very soon. So keep an eye on the Mezo Twitter and blogs for that, and then be on the lookout for increased use cases for putting your Bitcoin to work and actually beyond just like the HODL use case. That's what MUSD's focus is going to be. We have a lot in store for that. So we'll be, announcing some pretty big partnerships and use cases for that beyond the Mezo mainnet announcement. So those are probably the kind of the core main things that we're focused on right now as a team and scaling up. And then, I think there's also going to be some fun stuff for the community to do. We have a points program right now that you can, tap into as a user. And that'll, kind of snowball into other use cases that you'll be able to do on the chain with the actual Mezo native token. So keep an eye out for that as kind of the third major thing.
And then people can learn about all of that at mezo.org. Is that right?
Yes, mezo.org. Yep. We have a Mezo Twitter as well. And we're on pretty much every social platform you want to look on. There's a Mezo announcements channel on Telegram.
Okay. Awesome. Oh, one last question is as I'm thinking more and more about mind shares. Like mind share is in crypto anyway. Mind share is market share, and
the attention economy, right?
It's annoying at the same time as it is kind of like almost critical, right?
Yeah, totally.
How are you guys thinking about that?
In terms of capturing the mind share,
capturing mind share.
Yeah, I think obviously marketing and community are the engine of that. So outside of just like having content and activating our community, I think we're at maybe 200,000 plus members now on our community side. So we're growing pretty rapidly, but we haven't quite come out fully publicly yet from like a marketing standpoint. But that's obviously going to be changing now that mainnet is on the horizon. So expect to hear a lot more from us directly as a group with Mezo. And then, I think just in terms of like driving long-term value and user retention of the products, we think we've done a lot of work on this to make sure that the products are competitive and useful to folks. So I think, one of the key indicators to watch for this in terms of how successful we are in terms of like monetizing or growing that attention will be actual like unique wallets, for example, and number of users on the platform, and also fees in the chain, because that's how the flywheel is created. So I think one of the main items there that I'm personally paying close attention to as we kind of roll this out, go to market and scale it up will be those feedback loops from users and how that value accrues to the community and stakeholders within the Mezo chain. And we've designed some pretty cool mechanisms around this to create those value flywheels. And so that's I think if that works, which I'm feeling like it's going to, based on what we're seeing for testnet data and some initial demand, that'll probably be kind of speaking for itself in a lot of ways, and folks will show up. We just got to make sure they're educated and that they have a seamless experience to do it.
That's exciting. Brian Mahoney, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it, Peter.